everyone. Welcome to yet another session of In Dialogue Foundations Certificate Course in Dialogue Study 2023-2024. We have the privilege of having with us today Dr. Amir Ali, who would be speaking on the Socratic dialogue in the times of free speech fiasco. I'll just introduce Dr. Ali. Dr. Amir Ali teaches at the Center for Political Studies, JNU. Previously, he taught at the Department of Political Science, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, from 2004 to 2007, and was Agatha Harrison Memorial Visiting Fellow at St. Antony's College, Oxford, from 2012 to 2014. His areas of research are multiculturalism, group rights, and British politics. His latest books published are South Asian Islam and British Multiculturalism, and Brexit and Liberal Democracy, Populism, Sovereignty, and Nation State will be published by Routledge in July 2021. We welcome you, Dr. Ali. We'd like to tell you that you have 2 hours to conduct the session, which includes a question hour round. So you can conduct the session as in how you like, and the floor is all yours.
So thank you so much for asking me to give this talk. The title has been read out, The Socratic Dialogue in the Times of Free Speech Fiasco. So I'm going to kind of try to divide my talk into 2 parts. First, talk about the Socratic Dialogue, and then talk about what I refer to as free speech fiasco. Because I feel that the whole problem with free speech in contemporary times is that it's talked about more. And the more people talk about free speech, the more it tends to undermine the very thing that is being talked about, namely free speech. The Socratic dialogue, I'll spend, let's say, I don't know how many people are familiar with the notion or the idea of a Socratic dialogue. So I'll talk about Socrates for a while, a very important philosophical figure, the dialogue that he engaged in, the particular method that he employed, and how that got him into trouble, as a result of which he had to drink the hemlock, as it has been famously depicted in Plato's Apology. So let me begin with Socrates, the man himself. A very iconic figure, an iconic figure because he's a philosopher. He's considered to be a wise man. He was considered to be the wisest man of Athens. He spent most of his life in Athens. In fact, he rarely would venture out from Athens. He himself did not write anything. That's the thing about the enigma that is Socrates arises from the fact that he never really penned down his thoughts. The Socrates that we know is through four sources. The most prolific source is Plato, of course, his disciple. He wrote a series of dialogues, I think 36 in all, in which Socrates is the main interlocutor, the main person who does the speaking. Plato did his philosophy, or wrote his philosophy in the form of dialogues, which is a very interesting way of doing philosophy, because you have characters talking to each other in a dialogue. And as they talk to each other, they discuss and thrash out some very significant philosophical issues. So that's one source of Socrates, Socrates as depicted through his most famous disciple, Plato. The other source of Socrates is Aristotle, where Aristotle also talks about Socrates and his philosophy. Then a further source is Xenophon. And the last source is Aristophanes, the comic writer of Athens, who made a lot of fun of Socrates and would depict him as someone who had his, who talked about things under the ground and above the sky. So the point that I'm trying to make about Socrates is that there's an enigmatic quality to Socrates, the man. The enigma arises from the fact that he himself did not leave for posterity a written record of his own thoughts. And therefore, whatever we want to know about Socrates is through people who have written about him. What makes Socrates such a remarkable, iconic, philosophical and civilizational figure is the fact that in 399 BC, he was sentenced to death by drinking the hemlock, which is a plant that it's a poisonous extract from a plant. The reason why he was made to drink the hemlock was because there were 2 charges, pretty serious charges against him. The 2 charges that were made against him were that he was a bad influence on young people, that he was corrupting the morals of the youth, and that he was not sufficiently respecting the local city gods. So that's one reason why Socrates has become so significant. The most important account of Socrates that one finds is Plato's dialogue, The Apology, the apology does not mean Socrates saying sorry. It's his defense speech, which he gave to try to convince a large number of jury members that he was innocent of the charges that had been brought against him, but it did not work. Ultimately, he was convicted of the charges. He didn't get an acquittal. So it wasn't a very effective defense speech if one goes by the efficacy of a defense speech. But let me come to try to talk about Socrates and then go on to talk about the Socratic dialogue. Now, what makes Socrates so fascinating as a philosophical and a civilizational figure is the kind of attraction that he had towards the young people of Athens at his time. It is said that Socrates himself was a very ugly character to look at, portly, unkempt, would rarely wear sandals, did not have much money. But there was something about his persona that attracted young men, the long-haired youth of Athens, as it was described by Aristophanes. So we have to try to understand what exactly it was about this particular person, this man, that young people were so drawn towards him. So I'll give you a kind of a personal anecdote of my own first encounter with Socrates, not Socrates the philosopher, but Socrates the footballer. There was also a famous football player called Socrates, a Brazilian captain of the 1982 and 1986 World Cup sides. Brazil never won the World Cup. It's considered to be one of the most flamboyant teams in the world in terms of the way they play football. Now, the captain of the Brazilian football team was, of course, called Socrates. So for many years, I did not know that Socrates was a philosopher. I just thought that Socrates is a football player. But let me just draw this kind of very perverse analogy that I'm trying to make between the Socrates that I first knew when I was a child and the Socrates that I now read and talk and teach about. So in the year 1982, I'm going back 41 years. I'm sure many of you may have watched the World Cup last year, the Qatar World Cup. 41 years ago, 1982, when I was very small, I watched the 1982 World Cup, and I was fascinated by the Brazilian team. An uncle of mine told me, watch this team. They're absolutely wonderful when it comes to playing football. And I was absolutely mesmerized by the way that they would play football, the manner in which the ball would be passed around the pitch, a very fluid one-touch passing game that the Brazilians play. Now, the one man that struck me was a bearded, lanky captain, Socrates, who was really good. And I also got to know that he was not just a football player, but also a doctor, a pediatrician. And that also kind of intrigued me. I thought, what was a doctor doing on a football pitch? Now, the more that I read about Socrates, the more intrigued I became as a footballer. And there was something philosophical about the footballer Socrates. And he died in 2011 at the relatively young age of 56. He basically drank himself to death. And he was a very heavy smoker as well. Now, this point that I made about drinking himself to death was also true of Socrates as well. Of course, Socrates did not drink himself to death, but he was a heavy drinker. And the more he drank, the more control that he would have over himself. So he would not become drunk or would lose his senses. That's the account that is given of Socrates. Now, I'm making this analogy because I'm saying that there's something tragic in both these figures. Okay, Greek tragedy is a very significant part of something very specific about Greek tragedy. Now, a tragedy is a situation in which something bad happens to the protagonist. Okay, comedy is when you start laughing, when you have fun. But a tragedy is when something really nasty happens to the protagonist, the main character. Hero jisko hum log kehte hain Hindi film mein. Okay, or hero when the hero wins, we're all happy. But when the hero does not win, it's considered to be a tragedy. Now, there's something about a Greek tragedy which I want to kind of talk about. Now, the thing about a Greek tragedy is that the protagonist, the main character, has a certain kind of a set of qualities, a series of qualities, and yet is undermined by one fatal flaw, which proves to be the undoing of the protagonist. So the structure of a Greek tragedy is a kind of a fatal flaw, that one fatal flaw that proves to be the undoing. And the drama is such that it's inexorably moving towards this conclusion, this rather tragic conclusion. Now, when I talked about the Brazilian football team, I said that there was something very heroic about the captain and the football team. They played wonderful football, but they couldn't win the World Cup. Okay, in both 1982 and 1986, they were perhaps the best team, at least in my perspective. But then I asked myself the question, why couldn't they win the World Cup, especially in 1982? And I realized that one reason they couldn't win the World Cup was because there was a fatal flaw in the team. The fatal flaw in the team was their defense was not very effective. So when the team was attacking, every single player would be in the opponent's half. And on the counterattack, the team that would defeat them would be able to win. Now, I hope you've got the point that I'm trying to make about the fatal flaw. Okay, once again, my point is that a Greek tragedy is all about a series of admirable qualities that the protagonist has. Yet those admirable qualities, which may be numerous, are undermined by one simple, single fatal flaw. Now, the point that I now want to make about Socrates is that the one fatal flaw about this, the philosopher Socrates, not the footballer, okay? The one fatal flaw of the philosopher Socrates was he could not keep his mouth shut. Chup nahi reh sakta. He was something of a motor mouth. Now, it's interesting because the inability to keep one's mouth shut, to hold your tongue, means that at certain moments one will speak out of turn, especially in repressive societies, where everyone is told to shut up, not to speak. Okay, that's the hallmark of a repressive authoritarian regime. A repressive authoritarian regime does not allow free speech. At the same time, there are things that I'm going to talk about liberal free speech, which I will say are as ineffective as an authoritarian state. So the opening set of points that I'm making about free speech and dialogue is that whether it is an authoritarian society or a relatively open liberal society, in both cases, free speech is rendered ineffective in different sorts of ways. Okay? Please do raise a question, or if you find that you're not able to follow what I'm saying, please do ask me and I'll explain the thing again. But in terms of the opening points that I'm making, this is my argument. My argument is whether it is a relatively open liberal society or a repressive, dictatorial, tyrannical regime, in both cases, in different ways, the possibility of free speech is stifled in different ways. So in an authoritarian dictatorial state, people just cannot speak out. Okay, there's a regime of censorship. Either because you can't say things or people exercise what is referred to as self-censorship. They rather not say things because they don't want to get into trouble. All right? No, that's obvious. That's self-evident. On the other hand, my point about a liberal society is that liberal societies champion free speech. In fact, they fetishize free speech. And by fetishizing free speech, they are actually rendering that very specific free speech pretty much ineffective. Right? So it's quite remarkable how in both cases, somehow or the other, what free speech really should actually be bringing up is something which is rendered redundant, it's nullified in different ways, as I said. Okay, now it's intriguing how this happens, and that's what I intend to explore today. Now the question is, before I come to the Socratic method itself, the question I think we have to ask ourselves is, why free speech? Do we need free speech? Now, there have been some eloquent defenses of free speech. The one that I talk about quite a lot in my class, my master's students, I talk to them about J.S. Mill, John Stuart Mill, his famous 1859 essay on liberty. Now, in this very famous essay, Mill makes the point that imagine a situation in which you have the whole of humanity on one side saying one thing, and you have one small, puny, tiny, insignificant individual on the other side saying something else. Now, everyone wants to shut up this individual because they don't like what he's saying. Right? Now, going by a utilitarian calculus, which is the kind of philosophy that Mill espoused all his life, he was the son of James Mill, who was a utilitarian, and James Mill was himself a friend of Jeremy Bentham, who is widely considered to be the person who began this philosophy that we can refer to as utilitarianism, which talks about the greatest good of the greatest number, okay, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So if you envision this situation, which I'm asking all of you to think about, all right, just imagine in your mind's eye once again, the whole of humanity on one side, and the whole of humanity minus one, that one person on the other side, right? And every single person is saying one thing, and this one person is saying something which is contrary to what the rest of the people are saying. And he's saying something which is also deeply offensive to the other people. You know, we are a country of hurt sentiments, and we get roused up. Well, not just true of India. I think many other parts of the world are becoming increasingly insensitive, increasingly oversensitive to things that are said. Now, the point that Mill is making is, does one listen to that one person? And his answer is yes. Okay? And he gives us basically 2 or 3 reasons why we should be listening to that person. Now, one reason that is most obvious is that for all you know, that one person may be speaking the truth. And if that one person is not allowed to exercise his right of free speech, and if he's suppressed by this cacophony of voices on the other side, the whole of humanity, that means that the possibility of the truth will be eliminated by not allowing that one person to speak. Okay, that's pretty simple and straightforward. On the other hand, Mill asks us to think about the possibility of, suppose the person is not speaking the truth. Suppose that what he's saying is actually not right. And his argument is that even then, it's very important for people to be able to listen to that person. Because by listening to the opposite perspective, the opposite point of view, it is, through what is referred to as the collision of errors, we're able to arrive at a greater appreciation of the truth. Now, my point is this. Free speech does not exist for the heck of it. It doesn't exist because I just want to say whatever I want to say. Okay, free speech exists because this is one of the ways in which society has quite often arrived at a greater appreciation of the truth. Okay, I hope I've been able to make my point. Let me say this once again. The whole point of free speech does not exist just for its own sake. It exists because with the exercise of free speech, it is possible for a society to be able to arrive at a greater appreciation of the truth. I'll give you examples of this. Let me just take one example. 1963, 22nd of November, Kennedy's assassination. JFK, John F. Kennedy, America's perhaps most glamorous president. Of course, Obama was certainly glamorous. We have a possibility of a certain gentleman called Donald Trump coming back to power as American president next year. Strong possibilities that are happening. If it does happen, it means bad things for American democracy, in the way that I look at democracy. But let me go back to 63. Now, the official version is that John F. Kennedy was killed by one single bullet that was fired from behind him, from a warehouse by a man called Lee Harvey Oswald. That the bullet, it hit the president's shoulder, entered the president's body, pierced his heart, exited the president's body, grazed the seat of the car, the seat in front. He was traveling in an open air car, and hit the Secret Service agent in front. Now that's the official version. There is another version which says, well, there was actually firing from the other side. Now we don't know the truth. It's only when government documents are declassified after many, many years that we will get to know the truth. Now, that's my point. My point is that there are different versions. There are versions and there are versions. Now, in order to arrive at an appreciation of the truth, it is important for different versions to be able to be aired. Now, there are many, many instances of this kind. We just don't know what happened. Okay? I'm just giving you just one example. I'm sure that many people can think of many, many other examples in politics. When something is contested, there are conspiracy theories around, people don't know what happened. There's the official version that is put forward. And quite often what official versions do is that they suppress perhaps possibly the actuality of what actually had transpired. But to get back to my point, I'm going to make 2 points about free speech, and I'll talk about free speech fiascos later. The 2 points I want to make about free speech are this. A point that I've already made, another further point that I will make now. The first point that I've already made is that free speech does not exist for its own sake. It exists for the sake of arriving at an appreciation of the truth. My second point is that I often feel that free speech must be established as a value in societies across the world. There has been an instrumental way in which free speech has quite often been held up by the West, especially the Western media, Western human rights establishments. The Western governments have always talked about free speech instrumentally. So when it has suited them, they've talked about free speech. When it has not suited them, they go all the way out to suppress that free speech. And hence my point about liberal societies actually resulting in a suppression of free speech. Okay? Those are certain general points that I made about free speech. Let me get back to Socrates and his Socratic method. Socrates is often looked at as someone who was a proponent of free speech. Now, I'll tell you why. A little while ago, when I began this discussion, I was talking about how young people were drawn towards him. Now, let us try to understand why young people were so drawn towards an elderly man who was not particularly attractive to look at. I mean, when people think about young people, they think of, let's say, them being drawn to film stars, Shah Rukh Khan or Amitabh Bachchan or whatever, right? But here they are, the youngsters of Athens are drawn towards this man. Now, one of the reasons why they're drawn towards him is that he has a particular manner of carrying out a conversation. Okay, he has a particular conversational style. I'm one of those people who believes that the art of conversation is now dying because of the internet. That the communications revolution has had this remarkable, ironical outcome. That the more we communicate with each other, the more our ability to actually have a lively conversation has gone away. A conversationalist is someone who actually can conduct a conversation and keep and sustain people's interest and attention. That's the art of the conversation. A conversation arises when people disagree with each other. You cannot have a conversation when people are agreeing with each other all the time. Too much agreement kills a conversation, as we often say. So a conversation is built around contestation. Okay, it's built around disagreement. There's no point having a conversation if we're agreeing with each other. Now, that's the point about Socrates. Okay, his conversations would be full of contestation and disagreement. And he would conduct his conversations out in the Athenian marketplace, the agora as it was referred to. Okay, so as you would be going to the marketplace to buy things, if you imagine yourself, transport yourself back 2,400 years ago, you might find Socrates engaging in conversation. Now, quite remarkably, Socrates would initiate conversations on his own. He would just walk up to people, accost them, and ask the person to tell him or define for him something like, let's say, justice or piety or ideas of this kind, which are quite often difficult to talk about. I mean, suppose I would ask you, what is a biscuit? You would tell me it's something that you eat along with your chai or something like that. That's no possibility, no difficulty to find that. Or if I would ask someone to define or tell me about an elephant, there'd be no problem with that. The kind of conversations that Socrates is having are conversations about things, entities, which are abstract. Justice, love, piety, rhetoric, things of that kind. Okay, this is what he's talking about. Now, the remarkable thing is that when he asks people these questions, people think that they can answer him very easily. But as they give him an answer, they realize that their answers are actually falling short of their own expectations. Okay, you get the point? So it's basically like this. Socrates is asking people things that they think they know about. That for them, it'll be very easy to kind of answer these questions. But then once the answer has been given to Socrates, he starts picking holes in them. He says, hey, that's not true. Okay, let me give you an example. Suppose, I'm sure many of you ride a bicycle or drive a car, and you do it like second nature, right? You don't think about it. Now, suppose I would ask you to tell me and explain to me every single process of getting onto a bike or driving a car, right? So suppose I would ask, ask someone to explain to me how you drive a car. When you get into the car, you put the ignition key into the key into the ignition, you turn the ignition key, you press the clutch, you put the car into first gear, you release the clutch brake, press the accelerator, and the car starts moving forward. Okay? Now, the interesting thing here is that quite often we find it very difficult to talk about things which we think we are intimately familiar with. And that was the whole point of the Socratic conversation. Okay, the Socratic dialogue was meant to ask people to define things that they thought they knew. Now, it's very frustrating when you realize that you can't define something you thought you actually knew. Okay, it's that element of being tantalized, of feeling frustrated, which the Socratic dialogue opens up. All right, so what I'm kind of bringing up here in terms of explaining the Socratic dialogue is that it is premised upon things that are apparently self-evident, that require no further thought. And what it's opening up is the realization that people don't know what they're talking about. Now, that's a very unnerving thing. When someone tells you, you don't know what you're talking about, there's something very unnerving about that. And that's what Socrates is trying to say in this. Okay, now let me say a few more things about Socrates himself. Because of this habit that he had of asking people these slightly difficult questions, which they realize that they cannot actually answer, he gets into trouble with the authorities. Okay? So he's the motor mouth, the man who cannot keep his mouth shut. He gets into trouble Now, the reason why young people like this is because they realize that what he's doing is he's actually pulling down people with huge egos. He's creating a big bonfire of the vanities. This is the title of a novel by a novelist called Tom Wolfe, The Bonfire of the Vanities. So you know what a bonfire is. I'm sure that some of you are having bonfire parties in this very cold spell that we're going through. What Socrates is doing is that he's taking the egos and the vanities of Athens and setting light to them, basically by telling people, the people I'm asking questions actually don't know what they're talking about. Okay, so I'm trying to talk about Socrates as someone who gets into trouble because he's rubbing Athenian society up the wrong way. He's creating a whole bonfire of the vanities. And as a result of this, there are charges that are brought against him. Okay. Further, just a few more aspects about Socrates and the Socratic dialogue. The Socratic dialogue begins in this manner. It begins in this manner of Socrates accosting people. So, I imagine, suppose you go to the mall, so that many people go to the mall, and you find an elderly man, barefoot, coming up to you and asking you questions like, okay, define for me what patriotism is, or define to me what politics is, or tell me what rhetoric is, or tell me what think of anything. You would usually not be inclined at that particular point to answer that question, but here you have it. And this is the spectacle that Socrates creates. Now, imagine that the conversation got very intense in the mall. Okay, two people arguing with each other. Now, when two people argue in India, the thing that I've noticed is that two people arguing means that there are more people who then mill around and want to know what's going on. So that's a spectacle that Socrates creates. In the Athenian Agora, he begins a conversation. As the conversation becomes increasingly more contested and heated, disagreements start flowing. There are people who gather around to watch what is going on. So it's something that we refer to in Hindustani as a bit of a tamasha. So Socrates is creating something of a tamasha, something of a spectacle in terms of the conversation that he has initiated. Okay, and I think this is very true of the Indian public square. Two people arguing, there are five people who will immediately gather around to get to know what exactly is going on. And this is the reason why Socrates becomes very, very famous. He becomes very famous not for his lecturing, not for his writing. He never wrote anything. He becomes famous because he's someone who is a kind of a champion of conversation. He's someone who can't do without conversation. So what are the elements of the Socratic method? The first element of the Socratic dialogue is Socrates' demand for a definition. Okay? He will say, define justice for me. All right? Define piety for me. Now, the thing about a definition is that it's quite often very difficult to define something. If you were to ask me to define a book, there are lots of books lying in front of me, for example. There's this book that is lying here on my table. I would say, well, a book is a collection of pages bound between two covers. I would try to define it like that. Now, we always struggle when we try to define something because a definition means delimiting something, okay, by saying what it is not. Okay, a book is not a bicycle. A mobile phone is not a table. So the thing about a definition that Socrates asks us to do is that it's difficult, and therefore people end up telling us what it is not. Right? That's the beginning of a definition, right? Black is not white. White is not black. Okay, how do you define what black is? Well, it's not white. So that would be an example of a negative delineation of an entity, of saying, well, it is this because it is not that. So once again, what I'm trying to stress here is that one of the first elements of a Socratic dialogue is they demand for a definition. Now, you try it out. You tried, let's say, defining something which you thought you know very well. You would find it very difficult. I mean, if I said define sister, those of you who have sisters will say, oh, well, that's easy, so and so. But, not about a person, but the idea, the concept of what a sister is. It could be a companion, a sibling, someone you argue with. You have you could be very friendly at one moment. You grow up together. Whatever you have in mind, right? So that's my first point about the Socratic method. The second intriguing aspect of Socrates is that he says that he's asking these questions because he himself knows nothing. Okay, that's his claim. It's a claim of ignorance, which is a pretty strange kind of a thing to say because he is widely reputed to be the wisest man of Athens. Now, the wisest man of Athens going around saying that he knows nothing. It is quite a ironical statement to make, but that's what he was famous for. He was famous for making the claim that the only thing that he knew was that he knew nothing at all. Okay, so two aspects of the Socratic method. The first one, as I said, was the demand for a definition. The second one is that why did he demand definitions? Because he said he himself knew nothing at all. Let me add a third thing to this. Why did he do it? His point was, he did it because he felt that there were people of potential who could give birth to ideas. And yet they were not giving birth to those ideas. Now, giving birth is a difficult process. I mean, childbirth, bearing a child, I've been told is a very difficult process. There are birth pangs to go. Now, Socrates' point is this, that giving birth to an idea is a very, very difficult thing to do. And all that he's doing is he's acting as a midwife. This is his meiotic method. He's acting as a midwife. He's basically helping people to give birth to ideas. Now, if ideas are given birth to, that means that ideas clash and contend and contradict and conflict with each other, which means you have a conversation going. That's the reason why he's doing it. All right? So what we have in terms of the Socratic method, the Socratic dialogue, is the requirement that people start talking about things that they usually do not talk about. I'll give you an example of this. Let's take something called the free market, which I'm very sure all of you will be familiar with. Now, if you ask me personally, I'm against the notion of a free market. I think this is an idea that has dominated the world in an adverse sort of a way. It comes from neoliberals, people like Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek. These are philosophers who put forward the idea of a free market. We have free market economies across the world. India certainly is an example of a free market. Now, the question that people will not be willing to ask themselves is a free market doing good things to our society? Is it creating more inequality? Is it leading to more crime? Is it leading to the degeneration of democracy? These are conversations that are not being had. Okay, newspapers are not talking about this, and this would be Socrates' point. Socrates' point would be that people in our society are not talking about the things that really should matter to them. They're talking about things that actually do not matter. So I'll give you an example of this. Every time I meet my friends and relatives, most of the time I realize that the conversations steer around the best shopping mall in the area, property prices in Noida or Gurgaon, which always go high, the latest model of whichever car you want to buy. Now, that's his point. His point is that most of the time, society is having conversations that they should actually not be wasting too much effort over. They should be having more consequential conversations that matter. So around the dining room table, for example, I'm sure that there are families across the world that are discussing, let's say, the Russian attack on Ukraine or the situation in Gaza. Will there be a ceasefire or won't there be a ceasefire? I was just watching the news before this lecture began. And the US and the UK and Germany have now finally joined this chorus of a demand for a ceasefire. Now, I hope you got the point. You can have two kinds of conversations. You can have frivolous conversations, and you can have conversations that are consequential, conversations that have a certain significance to them. And the Socratic method, the Socratic dialogue, would be encouraging the more consequential conversations, the conversations that matter. And I'll give you an example of this. How many people talk about, let's say, whether a free market really is the best way to order society? Does a free market bring freedom? My view would be no, a free market does not bring freedom at all. Okay, that the free market actually becomes the last nail in the coffin of free speech itself. And that's my view. I'm not a free marketeer. I believe that the free market is a perverse idea. Now, there will be disagreements with this. I've had many. I live on a campus and I teach on a campus which is extremely contentious in terms of the debates that it has. And sometimes they become quite ugly, those debates. But once again, my point is that that's precisely the Socratic dialogue. It is meant to create a situation in society where people start talking about things that they should actually be talking about. Okay, so there are 3 or 4 aspects of the Socratic method that I talked about. Let me just mention just 1 or 2 more things about why Socrates got into trouble. Now, there are 2 readings that I've given. There's an email that I've sent out. This is from the Companion to Socrates. Now, in one of the articles, this is by Deborah Nails, the point that Deborah Nails makes is that around this time when Socrates was sentenced to death by drinking the hemlock, Athens was going through what is referred to as a wave of obscurantism. Now, when societies go through a wave of obscurantism, that means they become narrow. There are many things that you just cannot talk about in those societies. They become less open, less receptive to ideas. And that is one of the major reasons why Socrates was convicted rather than acquitted. So once again, my point is that what Socrates represents is a society that was unable to countenance the complexity of his ideas. When society is unable to countenance the complexity of a person's ideas, that what do they do to the person? They persecute him. Books are banned. Authors are persecuted. Many authors are killed. So if a society is not able to have a Socratic dialogue, that is a symptom of a moral malaise in that society. Okay, let me say this point once again. What does Socrates represent? Socrates represents the moral malaise of his own Athenian society. A society that could not countenance, could not bear the possibility of engaging in unsettling questions. Now, if a society is not able to do that, that means there's something terribly wrong. So once again, my point, which I'm trying to make as strongly as I can, is that the phenomenon of a Socrates being persecuted, to my mind, represents a moral malaise in a society unable to talk about some of the issues that it should be talking about. Now, the thing about difficult issues is that we don't want to talk, we brush them under the carpet. If that is the case, that means that we need to have certain conversations that we're not having. Okay, that's the point about Socrates that I'm trying to make. Let me make one further point. I talked about J.S. Mill a little while ago, J.S. Mill on liberty. Now, J.S. Mill in that essay mentions Socrates and Jesus Christ. And in both cases, what he's saying is that these two figures, iconic, canonical figures of history, represent how the society had become so pygmy-like in front of their intellectual stature that they could not bear them. And when you can't bear this, you get rid of them. I hope you got the point that I'm trying to make. My point once again is this, that when a society becomes diminished in terms of its intellectual stature, in terms of its considerations, it is not able to countenance the intellectual stature of someone like Socrates or Jesus Christ for that matter. There's a certain kind of a pygmy-like status of that society, and what happens is this kind of situation of what I'm calling a Socrates-like situation, right? So those are the points about the Socratic dialogue that I wanted to delineate and outline. Let me go on to what I mean by free speech fiascos. Okay, a fiasco is a spectacular defeat. That's what a fiasco means. Now, why am I calling it a free speech fiasco? Let me go back. One of the things that has influenced me in terms of the things I've written, a book I'm sure that you will have heard about, Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses. Okay, this is an event that happened 36 years ago. The book was banned. Unfortunately, we were the first country in the world to ban that book. We always have this dubious distinctions that we can lay claim to. So India happened to be the first country that banned the book. And of course, the book was banned in many other countries. There was the infamous fatwa against it. Now, my point, of course, is I'm completely against the ban. But my point is the way in which the West defended free speech. And the next few minutes that I'm going to spend, and I'll wind things up, as I said, in 45, 50 minutes. My point is that the defense of free speech that was put forward is a classic example of how not to defend free speech. All right. So when I talk about free speech fiasco, what I mean by free speech fiasco is a defense of free speech, which is a classic example of how not to do the thing. Right. The reason I've used the word fiasco is precisely because of how not to do it. So my point about the West's defense of free speech was this was a classic case of how not to do it. Now, the more they defended free speech, the more free speech has become fragile. So just think of the 36 years that have gone by since the Satanic Verses was published. It was published in September 1988. That's 35 years ago, is it? 35 years ago. Okay, in these 35 years, the principle of free speech has become that much more precarious. If you look at free speech indices across the world, India not doing well at all. And across societies, there is a certain kind of restriction that has been put on free speech. But in terms of the point that I'm trying to bring up here in terms of a free speech fiasco, is that it's so spectacular in its failure. It is spectacular in its failure because this is a classic example of how not to do the thing. Now, my last 2 points will be this. If free speech is so important, as I said, it is something that I feel must be developed, must be defended as a value. It must be instilled across society as a value, something which different societies must cherish, not just the United States of America, not just the United Kingdom, but all societies across the world, India, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and all these other countries are notorious in terms of how they suppress free speech because of the fact that they're not democracies, they are monarchies. Saudi Arabia, by the way, is the only country in the world which is named after a monarchy, Saudi, the House of Saud, which is quite remarkable. A country to be named after a monarchy is quite something. But generally speaking, across the world, free speech indices are showing a kind of a flagging of free speech itself. And this includes our own country. We're not doing well in terms of the press freedom index. And this is a matter of great concern. That means there's a moral malaise that is besetting this country, because of which the free speech index is falling. But to come back to my point, my simple point, and this will be my last point, and I'll open it up for Q&A if there are questions. My simple point is, you cannot defend free speech by talking about free speech. Okay? Free speech requires enabling conditions. Okay, what are those enabling conditions? I'll put forward 2 or 3 enabling conditions, and hopefully this will kind of spur some kind of a conversation around this. One of the most important enabling conditions of free speech is a society that has access to education, right? I mean, meaningful education, right? Where education is a public good, not something that has not become privatized. Right now in India, we are witnessing the commoditization and privatization of especially higher education. Now, that's my point. You cannot have free speech where education is the privilege of a few. Okay, I have specifically let's say, private universities, mine, Ashoka University, OP Jindal, which actually don't do very good with free speech and academic freedom if you've been following the news. So one enabling condition of free speech is education as a public good. Now, what does a public good mean? A public good means something that is held in common by society, right? The university that I teach in, JNU, one of perhaps India's most famous public universities, most controversial as well. Education here is pretty cheap because it's subsidized by the government. And then people turn around and say, oh, it's a waste of taxpayers' money. Actually, it's not. I'll tell you why. A public good is a good that is provisioned by the state through the exchequer, okay, through taxation. Why is this done? A public good, the philosophy behind it is that it creates a positive externality. Now, what does that mean, positive externality? It means that when someone acquires education, the benefits of that education do not remain confined to that person, but then spill over to the society of which that person is a part. So if a person is educated, has a good MA degree or has a PhD or whatever, or a BA for that matter, but has a good solid education, the conversation that person will be able to initiate will be of a much higher order compared to someone who has had a pretty superficial kind of an education. Now, that's the whole point behind a public good. A public good is provisioned because it creates a positive externality. I'll give you an example of a negative externality. I don't smoke, but I had lots of friends who did smoke. And if you are in the company of smokers, you become a passive smoker. Now, that's an example of a negative externality. The person is not just puffing as he smokes, but as he exhales, he is sending out, the smoke that is being exhaled is a smoke that is a health hazard for the people around him. You see the difference between a negative externality and a positive externality? And therefore, my point about free speech is that free speech must have a set of enabling circumstances. One of them that I just mentioned. I'll give you one last example of this, just to kind of make people think about why the defense of free speech was so wrong back in the 1980s when the Rushdie affair, as it's called, happened. What intrigued me about that affair, that incident, was that these valiant defenses of free speech were being mounted precisely at that time when in many Western countries, a certain media baron called Rupert Murdoch was acquiring a stranglehold over large swathes of the media. So in England, for example, where the Rushdie affair played out in a very controversial sort of way, by the time of the Rushdie affair, Murdoch had already acquired the very famous Times newspaper of London, had acquired The Sun, and had started acquiring Sky News. You must have heard of Sky News. Now, my point once again is you can't have free speech when one media baron controls large swathes of the media. In our own country, if you've been following the progress of the Adanis, who control NDTV and the INS news agency now, day before yesterday. Now, you can't have free speech when one person controls such a large segment of the media. And my last point, I said so much about free markets a little while ago. Juxtapose free speech with free markets. If you have free markets, you can't have free speech. And therefore, my point would be, bring back the Socratic dialogue because it encourages society to talk about things that people are most reluctant to actually be wanting to talk about. That was my last point. If there are questions, I'd be happy to answer those questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. This was a wonderful talk. I think it made me introspect a lot. At least I don't know about the others, but definitely me. I mean, there's so many things that were coming to my mind, especially the fact that our culture, the hierarchy, because our hierarchy is so strong. I think that is also not an enabler of
absolutely
free speech, and that's probably why our education system is also it doesn't encourage questioning or critical thinking. It encourages going with the crowd and staying in the community.
The bher chal, as the word goes.
Correct, and also like too much community. So that eventually the community is superior to the personal human, that one person that you said. So there were so many things that went on in my mind. I'm sure others have a lot of questions. So Muneet, Talika, Sonal, Zikra, Poonam, please raise your hand and you can. Sonal, would you like to go? Yeah.
Yes, that was one wonderful and intriguing session, Dr. Amir. I just want to, quickly, if you can repeat the last point you made. I think I just missed that part.
Free speech, free markets. Yeah, well, that's the point that I try to make most provocatively, because the free in front of markets suggests a certain kind of openness, which I don't think is the case. My point is that free markets do not lead to free speech. Now, the reason why I believe that they don't lead to free speech is because it's like this. The thing about the free market is that bad ideas chase out the good ideas, because it so happens that the bad ideas are the ones that sell the most. The good ideas are the ones that you have to kind of literally kind of cajole out of the darkness. The other reason, that's one reason why I'm making this point, and it's a pretty strong point that I often make in talks that I give. The other reason is that I have noticed that the thing about free markets is that they tend to create conglomerates, media conglomerates. I talked about the situation in India, in England, in America. What all of these instances suggest is the need to bring back public broadcasting, for example. The BBC, you must have heard of the British Broadcasting Corporation. It is a remarkable institution. Of course, it is something that's been compromised over the years by the British government. If the Conservative government has its way, it will lead to a further undermining of it. But that's the point about the public good that I'm making. These are essentially public goods. What the free market does is that it commoditizes everything. It sells you everything. It even sells you things that are not supposed to be sold. So I have no problem with, let's say, buying sabun and tel and stuff like that from the market. But when the market starts selling education and starts advertising education, that means something has seriously gone wrong with the market. Now, in my own lifetime, I'm now a middle-aged person. I have realized the way in which the concept of the market has become transformed from a simple, innocuous place to a much larger entity. So if I think of, let's say, 35 years of my own experience, when I was a child, 40 years ago, the market meant an innocuous place where you went and bought bread and eggs for breakfast or bhindi or stuff like that. Now the market has become this abstract entity that rules over people's lives through these remarkable forces of demand and supply. And it's this reification of the market that I'm trying to kind of suggest is not good for ideas of free speech. Why? Because I think what the market does is that it commoditizes information itself. Data is the big selling thing these days. It's considered the new oil. So that's the reason why I juxtapose the free market with free speech to suggest that you cannot have a Socratic dialogue with free markets. One further point: when I talk about Socrates, I talk about Socrates and the Agora. The Agora was the Athenian marketplace, a concrete place. Today's marketplace is an abstract idea. So we talk about markets, for example. How did markets respond to a political event, right? If you watch the news. And this transformation of the market from concrete to abstract is, to my mind, extremely dangerous when it comes to the whole question of what I call the Socratic dialogue and free speech. So I hope that kind of responds to your queries.
Yes, thank you so much. And I also want to know that how this Socrates dialogue would bring the change, because you said that it is much needed now. But how to bring that among the youth, and how to come up when you're saying that the free speech is not there today?
Right. Yeah. the thing about the Socratic dialogue, which I didn't talk about when I was speaking, is that it had this kind of a huge effect on the person who's being subjected to it. So different people who had partaken of the conversation with Socrates would say that it was a life-transforming experience. Someone said that he'd been bitten by a serpent in the soul. Now, that's a pretty strong statement to make. If someone, being bitten by a snake, I'm sure is not a nice experience. But if someone is bitten by a snake in the soul, that means that it's a hugely transformational moment. And the point about the dialogue was that it was meant to be that transformational moment, where people then started questioning the things that they had been doing up till now in an unthinking sort of way. So when I look at young people today, I'm often actually very worried, actually, because we have this situation of huge possibility of unemployment. And I often worry where these young people are going to go. Youngsters are more open to ideas. Youngsters tend to be more idealistic as compared to middle-aged people like me, who become kusat and grumpy. So it's the possibility of a transformation at a certain age, the effect that a dialogue like this can happen, what it does to young people, how they can reorient themselves and bring them to look at the world in a very different sort of a way. And thereby not lead the kind of dissipated lives that youth culture, unfortunately, is encouraging people to do. I mean, there's something called youth culture that's opened up since the 1960s. Okay, and this is all about consumerism. It's all about a particular kind of frivolity. Of course, young people are meant to enjoy themselves. I would never say that. But at the same time, the thing about young people is that there's a certain promise in them. And if that promise is dissipated, it leads to a certain kind of a dissipation of much youthful energy. And therefore, the Socratic dialogue would be the attempt to channelize that energy in not a didactic way, not in terms of do's and don'ts, ye karo, ye mat karo, but in terms of people asking themselves the question. That's the whole point of the Socratic dialogue. It makes people turn inwards rather than someone saying, do this. It's not nice to be told, right? Ye karo, mat karo. It's not didactic, but there's this certain kind of inward turn, which is quite effective.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I love this point. That's what I was waiting for. They should go inward.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Zikra has raised her hand. Zikra, you can go next.
Good evening, everyone. Am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you so much for the undialing session, sir. Thank you so much. My question is, to what extent does the Socratic method addresses the evolving nature of communication and technologies and their impact on free speech, particularly in the age of social media and digital platform?
Yeah, that's a good question. It doesn't. That's my simple, blunt answer. It doesn't. And the reason why it doesn't is because the Socratic dialogue is premised on a one-to-one conversation. It also has an ad hominem element. Now, by ad hominem is meant that the dialogue is designed and tailored according to the person that is being addressed. Now, platforms of mass communication, social media do not have that element. I consider them to be very dangerous things. I'm personally not a great fan of social media. I think that it's doing much more harm than it is doing any good at all. So the simple answer to your question is it does not. I am no great believer in education which is done on online platforms. I think there's a certain element of one-to-one conversation that is very, very important. Let me put it like this, Zikra. I'm someone who has, if I think back to, let's say, 1990s when I was a young person, I've lived through the communications revolution. And we were told there's a great deal of promise in the communications revolution. But let me use a Hindi word here. The Hindi word that I have in mind is vidambana, which is loosely irony. The vidambana or the irony of the communications revolution is that it has stymied the possibility of meaningful communication between people. So people are on their devices all the time, okay, sending WhatsApp messages and Instagram messages. But the actual art of the conversation, where people sit across a table or sit on chairs opposite each other and engage them in a meaningful conversation, has gone. And to go back to the previous question that Sonal asked, the possibility of the transformation arises from precisely that one-to-one element, that face-to-face contact. So I think social media is a force of a great deal of harm. It is harming the way that it's actually affecting our minds. The reason why social media is so addictive is because it tends to lock into that region of the brain where dopamine is produced. That's addictive. And therefore, I would personally not be in favor of an excessive use of social media. I'm an old-fashioned person in that sense. I believe that antitrust legislation must be brought about to break, let's say, digital behemoths like Google or Facebook or Twitter, X as it is now called. Why? Because it's leading to a kind of a lack of wisdom among people. It's leading to a certain kind of a frivolity, the kind of frivolity that the Socratic method was against. So to go back to your question, no, it does not deal with these problems at all.
Thank you for answering that. Poonam, would you like to go next?
Hello, good evening, everyone. Sir, thank you so much for such an enlightening session. And it was really thought-provoking. I'm just thinking about it. I don't have question right now. Thank you.
Okay.
Poonam, can you just introduce yourself once to
Sir, okay. I'm Poonam. I'm doing PhD from Center for Economic Studies and Planning, JNU. And
you're in JNU, great. Okay,
yes,
wonderful.
Sir. I have seen you, sir, in the campus.
Oh, right, wonderful. I'm in same building as you are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lovely. That's great. Another connection made. So, Munir, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free. Otherwise, you can introduce yourself as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Amir, for the session. I assume I'm audible. So
yes, I can.
Yeah. I have certain questions and comments. I would like you to know about the dichotomy or the oxymoron of religion and free speech. It has been age old. And
sorry, what in free speech?
Religion and free speech.
Religion and free speech, yeah.
Okay. So you talked about satanic verses. There are Charlie Hebdo cases, and
yes, that's right.
In India has been a hub of it now from the last many years. So how do we see, first of all, free speech, and if we do we include hate speech, as they call it, in free speech as well? Is it part of it, or is it just a bad word given to a good thing? And should there be any qualifications, like if there is 18 years one is required to vote, should there be any minimum qualifications for anyone to say anything in public, like abusing anyone or contradicting anyone? As they say, emotions have to be taken into consideration and others. How do we tackle this? How do we imbibe a free speech culture in religious things when we are living in a country that is known for its diversity? I would like for your comments on that, and how Socratic dialogue can guide us in these things, and what was the situation at the time of Socrates in terms of religion and free speech? I would like your comments on this. Thank you, sir.
So let me begin from the last few set of questions. On the question of free speech and restrictions, I do believe in restrictions. I'm not a free speech absolutist. I think free speech absolutism is extremely irresponsible. Elon Musk is a free speech absolutist, and he's not the most reliable character as far as I'm concerned. So I'm not in favor of free speech. Now free speech absolutism I'm not in favor of. Now the reason why I'm not in favor of free speech absolutism is because I believe that free speech does not exist for its own sake. It does not exist for just for the heck of it, just because you have to say something. Free speech exists because it is a mechanism or a medium through which people arrive at a greater appreciation of the truth. Now, philosophically speaking, I'm one of those people who believes that we do have some notion of an objective truth that we can all arrive at. I'm no postmodernist who believes that the truth is a construct, that it's all about contending narratives. I believe that philosophies like postmodernism have done a great deal of harm in terms of rejecting the idea of truth as something that can be arrived at from various facets. So that's my position in terms of restrictions. The Indian Constitution, Article 19, talks about free speech, and there are restrictions, right? Reasonable restrictions, public order, health, and morality. The line that I can recall. So it's entirely reasonable to have restrictions on free speech. Also, someone cannot exercise his free speech by, let's say, the example that Mill makes is that if you stand in front of a let's say, a merchant's house, a grain merchant's house, and start saying nasty things about a grain merchant, so that a mob is incited against that's not free speech. That's incitement. Now, on your question of hate speech and free speech, it's very clear. There's a distinction. I do not believe that there is a place or that there's a point where free speech shades off into hate speech. My understanding of free speech and hate speech is that they come from opposite ends of the spectrum. Now, what do I mean by that? For me, and this is a very Socratic point to make, the Socratic dictum was to speak truth to power. Now, my point about free speech is that it must, of necessity, be directed against the powerful. Okay, it must ask questions of the powerful. If it's not doing that, that means there's something wrong with the character or the quality of that particular free speech. I'll give you an example of this. Sahir ka bahut famous line, Sahir Diani ka bahut famous line hai, "Ae rehbaro qaum mulk bata, aankhein to utha nazre tu mila, ye kiska lahu tak kaun mara." Now that's an example of free speech when you're literally locking eyes with the powerful and asking the powerful to answer in terms of ensuring accountability. The point about hate speech is it's all about the strong directing a stream of invective against the weak. You see the difference between free speech and hate speech? It's a directionality with flow. Free speech must of necessity flow from the weak to the powerful to hold the powerful to account. Hate speech flows from the powerful as an invective towards the weak. That would be my understanding. Now, Charlie Hebdo, let me take up that because I did write about Charlie Hebdo. Now, my point about the cartoons was, yes, I mean, of course, people must have the right to write the books that they want to. And they are well within their rights to do that. The thing about Charlie Hebdo was that the cartoons, I was personally very offended to see those cartoons. And I thought that in the way that the North African section of the French population, the fact that North Africa, Algeria, and Tunisia were French colonies, what the cartoons were doing was that they were, in some ways, snatching away the element of dignity that the North Africans had in terms of what they held dear. So, the Charlie Hebdo cartoons were not cocking a snook at the powerful. They were making fun of the vulnerable. Because the Prophet is a figure of immense respect. So every time religious sensibilities of that kind are hurt, I think this rule must be applied. Is it, in some ways, is it the powerful political literary establishment making fun of people? To answer your question, in this way, to make a difference between free speech and hate speech, all I'm suggesting is look at the direction in which it is flowing. Is it flowing from the powerful to the weak? Or is it flowing from the weak to the powerful? If it's weak to powerful, I would take that as an example of free speech rather than the opposite of the powerful to the weak. The point about the fatwa, what has intrigued me in the West is that the word fatwa was introduced in the Oxford English Dictionary in 1988. That was the year that it was introduced into the lexicon. Now, whenever I've talked to Westerners, I've felt that for them, they believe that the fatwa is one of the biggest, it's the anathema of free speech. And the question I asked him is the question that I raised. What about Murdoch, who at that time was consolidating his stranglehold in the name of free markets? So if one were to ask me, of course, yes, there are fatwas that are against free speech. I'm not denying that for a minute. But at the same time, my point is that in terms of the way that free speech has been undermined and compromised, I would think of the free market as being the bigger underminer, agency of undermining free speech rather than the fatwa. And this is the blind spot that the West doesn't get. It doesn't seem to get this point that it was championing free speech precisely at that moment when the possibilities of free speech themselves were being undermined through the advancement of the free market. And this is a point that I've often made provocatively. I've asked people the question, do you think the fatwa is a bigger underminer of free speech or the free market? And people said fatwa, which I'm not denying it for a minute. Yes, there have been fatwas that have undermined free speech. But if you look at the larger structure of the free market, the systematic manner in which that has undermined free speech is nothing compared to one or two fatwas that have been issued once in a while, which certainly have gone against the spirit of free speech. Does that answer your question, Munir?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much for the clarification. Thank you.
Thank you. Tulika, do you have any questions, comments, or yeah? Okay, go ahead, please.
Good evening, everyone. So, sir, this was a very, very enlightening session. I personally am quite moved because I've been a great fan of Socrates. Not in a way that I have been appreciating him. I have been criticizing him a lot in few aspects, especially his decision about not leaving Athens and then drinking the hemlock. I mean, I also am pursuing my PhD from Lucknow University, and my subject has been philosophy. My topic is philosophical counseling. And Socrates' dialogue is considered to be, his dialogic methods are considered to be one of the most influential and beneficial ways to help somebody, basically to heal, or the interpersonal transformation in one of the articles that you had sent. So I was going through it. But I do have few questions about this. When we talk about free speech, so what I personally feel is like if we, as you mentioned, that Socrates was asked to drink the hemlock, or any other influential person who who makes individual, especially youth, think freely, is somehow deprived of the free will, basically. They don't have the will to live, basically. So does this mean that if we have free speech, we have to be ready to maybe face some sort of radical result, or maybe death or something like that? Because to me, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, I very often have this conversation with my supervisor, who is also one of the expertise of Greek philosophy. So I always put up this question that he always had a choice to leave it. Then my supervisor's take is simply, we wouldn't be reading about the guy if he wouldn't have drunk the hemlock, basically.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I still am very skeptical about this, sir. So basically, you also mentioned one very nice phrase that I found was one fatal flaw. Right.
Yeah, that's a big tragedy. Yeah.
Right. So as you said, all the admirers' qualities are destroyed by one fatal flaw. So what, according to you, in the term of Socrates, when we talk about him, what according to you could be his fatal flaw? And there's this another, I just had this thought, like when you said that Socrates, his motive was for us to go inwards, right? The energy should be inwards, which would help us question like thoroughly and think freely. This guy never used to shut up. So you yourself mentioned it like a few minutes back. So I don't understand how would that make any sense of getting inwards. And yeah, sir, I think that's all my like comment about the entire thing. Yeah.
So let me take this point about leaving, because you do mention that it is a significant point, because he was offered the choice of going into exile to Thrace, which is that part of Turkey which is now in Europe. Many people have talked about this. So let me focus on that, because it's an important question. Now, why didn't he leave? One reason why he didn't leave was he couldn't bear to be away from Athens. You know, there are some people who become so associated with a certain place. You take them out of that place, you know, there would be something taken out, an essence would be taken out of them. That is the way that, you know, that decision is getting. I'll give you a very contemporary example of this. I'm reading a book right now. This is a book that has got the Booker Award this year's book. It's by the Irish writer Paul Lynch. It's called Prophet Song. Those of you who are interested in this kind of writing, do read it. Now, that book I'm still reading it, and it's pretty riveting, because it's a book that mirrors the contemporary politics of our times, right? It's a story about Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, pretty progressive country, which has fallen into a far-right fascist dictatorship. All right? It's a story of one family, of a woman who is a biotechnologist, who has a job. She has 4 children, and her son is taken in by the police for questioning, and he disappears. All right? Now, the book has some very riveting lines. One of those lines is about how her sister, the main character, whose name is Eilish, her sister is encouraging her to leave Ireland and come to stay with her in Canada. A lot of people do that, right? They go into exile when things get difficult. Now, the point that the sister makes is that if you don't take this decision right now, you'll be one of those people who will be silenced by the regime. Right? Now, many people have gone into exile. Now, the line that still haunts me is that history is a record or is full of the silences of those people who didn't know when to leave. Okay? Then it goes on to say that some people can leave. They have the wherewithal, the resources, places to go to. There are some people who are so firmly planted in the societies of which they are a part that to leave would mean to cut off their own feet. That's Socrates for you. He couldn't leave. He's so completely planted into Athenian society that to leave would mean to cut off the roots of his own feet, and hence the decision not to leave. And I think that it's important to understand that because, well, of course, people leave, but who are the ones who leave? The ones who leave are the ones who have the wherewithal, the money, the connections. If it's a university academic, the university academic will be offered a bit. Einstein, for example, left Germany. Why? Because Princeton was offering him a position. Oxford was offering him a position. Many Jewish academics left. The ones that left were the ones who had connections. The ones who couldn't were the ones who did not. They're the more meaningful ones. And I think the answer to your question is actually, in the way that I'm giving the answer is in terms of the book that I'm reading. Leaving means cutting off your own feet, which are so completely planted and rooted in the soil of which you're a part. It just becomes, it's a non-starter. So I hope that answers that question about his decision not to leave.
It does.
Okay, the fatal flaw. In Socrates' case, it's all about keeping your mouth shut. He can't do it. Now, the thing about keeping your mouth shut is it doesn't work. All right? There's that very famous line, those lines by Martin Niemöller, who was a Lutheran pastor in Nazi Germany. I'm sure you will have heard of it. So the first they came for the trade unionists. I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the socialists. I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the Jews. I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. And when they came for me, there was no one left to speak for me. The whole point is, keeping quiet is not an option. At some point, a person must say what is unjust, speak out against it. And therefore, Socrates for you. He had to speak out. Holding your tongue doesn't work. It doesn't work because when, the authorities come for you, there's no one left to speak for you. Okay, so I think Martin Niemöller's lines are perhaps the most haunting in terms of the futility of holding your tongue. There's no point to it. It doesn't get one anywhere. Tulika, does that kind of answer those two questions that you had?
Yes, sir. So basically, Socrates' idea of going inward would be like not keeping his mouth shut.
Let me just, actually, I didn't address that question. So let me focus on this term speech, logos, because the Greeks had the same word for speech and reason, logos, right? Now, the point about speech is that it's actually a kind of a channeling of something that's coming from within. The thought processes are happening from within. It's just a kind of an external manifestation of what is going on in your mind. So it's the bridge between the inward and the outward. And to hold one's tongue is actually to cut one's inside off. Logos, speech, represents the simultaneity of thinking and speaking. And therefore, there is no kind of a dichotomy between the inward and the outward. In fact, to be silent would be to kind of undermine the inward itself, which is why speaking is so important for Socrates. It's almost a kind of living for him. Okay?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for your answer, sir.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I had a couple of more thoughts, with these questions. In fact, when you talked about when the free speech that flows from the weaker to the stronger, and not the vice versa, it just kind of reminded me of the cartoon that had come up when they showed when India went into space, and then Mangalyaan, they showed this Indian with a cow trying to enter elite space club.
Yeah,
so,
that's right. Yeah.
So that was, it was not religious, but I think almost everybody agreed that, there was no debate about it, that it was offensive because it went from the stronger to the weaker.
Western condescension. It's condescension.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So
condescension is not free speech.
I could kind of relate it with the Charlie Hebdo cartoons as well, somewhere. And the second thought that came was from, Tulika's question about why people don't leave. And then there's there's this entire, it just made me think about Afghanistan. There were people who had connections and they left. And even in Palestine, there are people who could leave, or Syria, people could leave. Who could, they left. And so not everybody has.
Not everyone can leave. Leaving does not solve the problem. In fact, leaving makes the problem worse, actually.
For the people, yes. So one of the speakers at In Dialogue had actually talked about that when Pakistan shows the sympathy for Indian Muslims, what they don't realize is that the best of, the most privileged people who were scholars and lawyers and they went. So
Absolutely.
if you abandon the people behind, then you really cannot. You should have stayed and fought. So I think that was one of our speakers. So I guess it's all resonating. All this different things that we've heard at this forum are kind of resonating again. So I'm so glad you gave us so much food for thought. If anybody doesn't have any further questions, we can close the talk. But thank you. It was absolutely amazing, and we try that. At this course, we try and bring out more questions or more thoughts, and even something that again triggers our critical thinking. So I think that's something we're all taking back with us. So thank you, Dr. Ali, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you so much.